Welcome to the Terror Time.
The first story is about the phantom in the fog. It was a late autumn evening when I found myself walking alone past the old cemetery on the edge of town. The fog had rolled in thick, swirling around the gravestones like smoke, and the air carried a biting chill that made me pull my jacket tighter around my body. I had heard stories about this cemetery, ghost stories passed down through generations, but I never paid much attention to them. I wasn't the type to believe in the supernatural. That changed that night. As I walked along the wrought iron fence that surrounded the cemetery, something caught my eye. Through the thick mist, I saw movement, a figure standing near one of the older headstones. At first, I thought it was just someone else out for a walk, maybe paying their respects to a loved one, but something about the way they moved felt wrong. The figure was too still, too silent, like they weren't really there at all. Curiosity got the better of me. I slowed my pace, trying to get a better look through the fog. The figure remained motionless, almost blending into the mist, its outline faint and shadowy. My heart began to race, and chills ran down my spine as I realized that this wasn't an ordinary person. The way the figure seemed to flicker in and out of view made it clear. I was looking at a real ghost. The air around me grew colder, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I wanted to turn back, to leave that place and never return, but I couldn't. Something about the phantom kept pulling me in, like it wanted me to come closer. Against my better judgment, I stepped through the gate and into the cemetery, the fog closing in around me. The figure was still there, standing by the grave, its head bowed as if in mourning. As I got closer, I could make out more details. Long, dark robes that seemed to billow in the wind, even though there was no breeze. Its face was hidden, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and piercing, like it was staring straight through me. I stopped a few feet away, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to say something, to call out, but the words caught in my throat. The figure remained still, silent, as the fog swirled around us. And then, without warning, it moved. The figure turned slowly, its head lifting to face me. As it did, the fog seemed to pull back, revealing a face that was pale, gaunt, and twisted into an expression of pure evil. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to draw me in, and its mouth was stretched into a twisted grin that sent a wave of terror through me. I took a step back, but the phantom followed, gliding silently over the ground. The air grew colder still, and I could feel a suffocating pressure closing in around me. This wasn't just a spirit. This was something much darker, something that shouldn't have been there. The stories I had heard about the cemetery came rushing back to me, tales of people who had seen things in the fog, things that had followed them home, haunting them long after they left. My legs trembled as I turned to run, but I couldn't move. The phantom's gaze held me in place, freezing me with fear. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the truth was clear. I was in the presence of something supernatural, and it wasn't going to let me go. The phantom moved closer, its form flickering like a shadow in the mist. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, a deep, unnatural chill that cut through me like a knife. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fought to move, but it was like the air itself had turned to ice, trapping me in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the phantom vanished. The fog closed in around me once more, and the cemetery was silent again. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart still racing, but the figure was gone. It was as if it had never been there at all. But I knew what I had seen. I knew that I had come face to face with something that defied explanation. I didn't waste any time. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was far from the cemetery. The fog seemed to follow me, swirling in the corners of my vision, but I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the phantom was still there, watching me from the shadows. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air around me felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest, and I kept catching glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. At night, I would wake up gasping. The memory of the phantom's twisted grin burned into my mind. It was as if the paranormal activity from the cemetery had followed me home. One night, I woke up to a sound, a faint whisper, so soft I almost didn't hear it. I lay there, frozen in bed, my heart pounding in my chest as the whisper grew louder. It wasn't coming from inside the house, it was coming from outside, from the direction of the cemetery. My blood ran cold. I got up, moved to the window, and peered outside. The fog had returned, thick and swirling, and through the mist, I saw it, the same figure, standing just beyond the gate, watching me. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and I knew it was waiting for me to come back, to finish what had begun. I closed the curtains, my hands trembling, but I could still feel its presence, like a dark cloud hanging over me. The phantom wasn't just a lingering ghost, it was something far more sinister, something that had crossed over from another world. I've never gone back to that cemetery, but I know the phantom is still out there, waiting in the fog. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint whisper of its voice calling to me from the shadows. I try to ignore it, but I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. The second story is about the phantom that walks between the graves. The night I encountered the phantom, I had no intention of visiting the cemetery. I was on my way back from a friend's place, taking a shortcut through the outskirts of town when I found myself passing by the old graveyard. The place had always given me a strange feeling, like the air around it was heavier, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't until I saw the gate slightly ajar that something compelled me to stop. The cemetery was small, forgotten by most, with crumbling headstones and twisted trees casting long shadows in the dim light of the moon. I had heard plenty of ghost stories about the place, stories of people seeing figures moving between the graves, hearing whispers in the wind, but I had never believed them, until that night. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, the sound sending chills down my spine. I stepped inside, feeling the cold air wrap around me like a shroud. The cemetery was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. As I walked along the narrow path, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the further I went, the stronger the feeling became. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and flickering like they were alive. My heart began to race, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape moving between the graves. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and turned to face it. Standing near an old weathered tombstone was a figure, its outline faint in the moonlight. It was tall, shrouded in darkness, and completely still. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then the figure moved. It didn't walk like a normal person. Instead, it seemed to glide across the ground, silent and unnerving. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it move between the graves, its form flickering like a shadow that couldn't quite stay solid. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just some stray animal or the wind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't a normal person. This was something else, something supernatural. The figure stopped near a particularly large grave, its head turning slowly to face me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its gaze, a cold, piercing stare that sent a wave of terror through me. My body stiffened, and for a moment I couldn't move. It was like the air around me had thickened, trapping me in place. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching me with a stillness that was anything but human. And then, without warning, it began to move toward me. It glided across the ground, closing the distance between us with unnatural speed. My legs trembled as I backed away, my mind racing with fear. I had heard stories of phantoms, of real ghosts that haunted old cemeteries, but I had never truly believed them. Until now. The air grew colder, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me, like a demon lurking just out of sight. My breath came out in short, panicked bursts as the figure drew closer, its form becoming more defined, more menacing. It wasn't just a ghost, it was something darker, something filled with evil. I turned and ran. I didn't look back as I bolted through the cemetery, my feet pounding against the earth. The sound of my own breathing echoed in my ears, but I could still feel the phantom behind me, its cold presence chasing me through the darkness. The trees twisted and warped as I ran past them, their shadows reaching out like claws trying to pull me back. Just as I reached the gate, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The figure was still there, standing at the edge of the cemetery, watching me with those empty, dark eyes. It didn't follow me any further, but I knew it wasn't finished. It was waiting, biding its time, like a predator that had already marked its prey. I slammed the gate shut behind me and didn't stop running until I was far from the cemetery. My heart raced in my chest, and my mind was a blur of terror and confusion. What had I just seen? Was it really a ghost, or was it something worse? I couldn't shake the feeling that the phantom wasn't done with me, that it had followed me out of the cemetery and into the night. For days after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing between the graves, its cold gaze fixed on me. The memories haunted my dreams, turning them into twisted nightmares that left me waking in a cold sweat. No matter how hard I tried to forget, I couldn't shake the feeling that the phantom was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to return. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a sound outside my window, a faint whisper carried on the wind. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. I knew that voice. It was the same voice I had heard in the cemetery, the same voice that had followed me home. I got out of bed and moved to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtain. The street was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. And then, just beyond the edge of the light, I saw it. The same figure, standing in the shadows, watching me. It had followed me. I slammed the curtain shut, my heart racing in my chest. The phantom hadn't just stayed in the cemetery. It had come for me, crossing over from whatever dark place it had come from. I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, lingering just outside, waiting for me to let my guard down. I've tried to move on, to pretend that the phantom was just a figment of my imagination, but I know better. It's still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, growing louder, closer, and I know that one day it will come for me. The third story is about the Watcher of the Cemetery. There's something about graveyards at night that makes them feel different, more alive in a way. I never believed in ghosts, but I always felt uneasy walking past the old cemetery near my neighborhood. It was a small place, tucked away behind a row of trees, forgotten by most, except for the occasional visitor paying respects to long-departed family members. But at night, the air around it seemed to change, growing colder, heavier, like the ground itself was waiting for something. One evening, after a late shift at work, I found myself walking by the cemetery again. The sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, casting the entire area in darkness. My footsteps echoed softly on the pavement, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. As I passed the cemetery gate, I couldn't help but glance inside. That's when I saw it. A figure standing near one of the graves. At first, I thought it was just someone visiting a loved one, though the late hour made that unlikely. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, and unmoving. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But something about the figure felt wrong. The way it stood so still, like it wasn't really there, but at the same time, I knew it was watching me. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that someone, or something, was following me. But as I rounded the corner, I couldn't shake the cold that had settled into my bones. I could still feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing, even though I was far from the cemetery. For the next few nights, I avoided the cemetery altogether. I didn't want to risk seeing the figure again, even though part of me doubted whether it had been real in the first place. But as the days passed, I began to notice strange things happening around my house. The lights would flicker for no reason, and cold drafts would sweep through the rooms, even though the windows were closed. It wasn't long before I realized that whatever I had seen in the cemetery hadn't stayed there. It had followed me. One night, as I sat in my living room, I heard a faint sound like someone whispering my name. My blood ran cold, and I froze, listening intently. The whisper came again, louder this time, coming from just outside the window. My heart raced as I slowly turned my head, my eyes locked on the darkened glass. The room was dimly lit, but I could see the faint outline of something standing outside. Something tall, dark, and watching me. The figure from the cemetery. I jumped from my chair, pulling the curtains shut, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. But deep down, I knew the truth. The figure wasn't just some person visiting a grave. It was something far worse. Something supernatural. And it wasn't done with me yet. For the next few days, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing in the cemetery, its cold gaze locked on me. The whispers continued, growing louder each night until I could barely think straight. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, that I was imagining things, but the signs were all there. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something darker, something filled with evil. One evening, as I sat alone in the house, I heard the sound of footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving from room to room. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring into the darkness. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. But then I saw it. The figure was standing at the top of the stairs. It was the same dark shape I had seen in the cemetery, only now it was inside my house. Its form was shadowy, almost formless, but I could feel its presence. Cold, oppressive, and filled with malice. My body froze, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it slowly descended the stairs, each step deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. The room grew colder as the figure approached, and I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on me. This wasn't just a spirit. It was something far more dangerous. A demon, maybe. Or something even older, something that had crossed over from a world I couldn't understand. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me, its form flickering like a shadow in the wind. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was trapped. There was no escaping it. I had invited it into my life, and now it was here to take what it wanted. Just as the figure reached out toward me, I felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and racing outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The cold night air hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop running. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. I don't know how long I stood there, staring back at my house, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway. But it never appeared. The house was dark and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I knew the figure was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance. For weeks I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sent me into a panic. I kept the curtains closed, and I avoided the cemetery at all costs. But the figure didn't need the cemetery anymore. It had found me, and it wasn't going to let go. The paranormal activity only grew stronger as time went on. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut in the middle of the night, and the whispers never stopped. I was living in a nightmare, one that I couldn't escape. I knew the figure was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Eventually, I moved out of the house, hoping that leaving would break the connection. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the figure is still with me, lurking just out of sight. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of my vision, and I hear faint whispers in the dead of night. The figure from the cemetery wasn't just a fleeting apparition, it was something far more sinister, something that had attached itself to me. And no matter how far I run, I know it will always find me.